talk about stories. I'm here to talk about the role that stories play in shaping our values and our belief systems. I'm a narrative scholar. I study stories, how they work, how they affect our perceptions, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about narrative theory today in order for you to understand just how easy it is to manipulate us through stories. So you've probably heard the phrase that human beings are storytelling animals. What does that mean? It means that humans make sense of the world through stories. It's our primary mode of communication. It's also our primary mode of navigating the world. There's a theorist, a scholar named Walter Fisher, who actually argues that we reason through stories, not just through logic, but also stories. And what he does is identify two different ways of thinking of the world, the narrative paradigm and the rational world paradigm. That narrative paradigm is, like I'm saying, the way that we understand the world through stories. The rational world paradigm, it's logical. This is how we understand the world and make decisions through evidence, through logic, argumentation, so on and so forth. And we all know there are contexts in which it's very, very appropriate to make sense of the world through logic, to make decisions based on evidence, like buying a car, picking which college to attend. But the thing is we're not really quite as Spock as we think we are. Logic is hard, okay? And the narrative paradigm, thinking of the world through stories and reasoning through stories, that's a lot easier. It's instinct. The rational world paradigm, that's something that has to be taught, and it comes a lot later. Think about language. Some of the first things that we learn to do in language, we learn to narrate. We tell stories, okay? It's when we get to school and we start to learn about argumentation, so on and so forth. Now, the narrative paradigm, like I said, it's the way that we understand the world through stories. It's what explains why we just can't help but make stories out of everything. We're always telling stories for ourselves, for other people, right? We look at this image and you cannot help but instinctively create a story for this adorable little girl, right? Now, she isn't just here in this frame. She came from somewhere and she is going somewhere in our minds. Actually, I think she's probably telling herself a little story too, right there. The story I make up for her is not the same story that you make up for her, because every one of us uses our own individual framework, our mental framework, our own knowledge, our own values, our own experiences of the world in order to tell stories about each other and ourselves. The narrative paradigm is what explains why not just a single image, but any single phrase or word can conjure up an enormous, very complex story behind it. All I have to do is say, Watergate, or the Challenger, or 9/11, right? And immediately, a very complex story rushes to your mind, right? This is instinct. This is spontaneous. We need to read the world through stories in a way. We learn to do so very young, very early. We learn that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what makes them stories. Thank you, Aristotle, okay? We begin to see the world in this linear way as well, and that's how we come to make sense out of it. We take any individual fact or event that happens, and we slot it into the narrative that is unfolding around us. We're actually taught very young to do this if we think about K through 12 education, about history, social studies, even science. Do you guys remember learning the journey of the red blood cell through the body? That's a story, right? How a bill becomes a law. That's a story, okay? Facts need to make sense to us as human beings, and the easiest way to do that is to slot it into a story, to give it context and turn it into a narrative. The rhetorical power of narratives is incredible because of this need to slot everything into stories. The dangerous thing here is that myself and my fellow narrative scholars, we're not the only one who knows about this narrative paradigm thing, and that actually makes it very easy to manipulate and exploit us. So let me go back to Walter Fisher again. So he has this idea about narrative rationality. That's this concept that we reason through the world in stories, okay? It's got two important concepts, coherence and fidelity. Coherence is the idea that a story hangs together for us, okay? That it has internal logic. If we're talking about a fictional story, the characters make decisions that we think they should make. The plot progresses in the way that we think it should, given what's happened previously, okay? We love coherence, right? Coherence also has to do with our understanding of the laws of the universe, right? We're always comparing the story against our world and how it works. And even if we're talking about fictional worlds, the ones that aren't quite like ours, we're still talking about equivalent physical laws, right? We're also talking about story laws, right? For coherence, for a story to hang together, it also has to correspond to stories that you know that you've heard previously, okay? Now, the next time that you go to a movie and you're really angry about all the plot holes, this is what you want to blame, the narrative rationality in you, okay? But the other concept, fidelity, that a story feels true, is a little bit stickier, if you ask me. That's the idea, not that a story is a true story, but that a story feels true to us given our existing value system, okay? So when you read a story, you compare it with your own value system. If it matches up, then you may be willing to use it as a guide for your own actions and behaviors. But if it doesn't match your existing value system, you're actually very likely to reject it, to think that it's false, that it's untrue. And that kind of makes it difficult, right, to learn anything new from stories if you're just going to reject the ones that don't correspond to what you already know and feel, right? So recognizing these things, right, coherence, fidelity, this doesn't take training. This is just gut instinct. Because over and over, through time, we pick up an unconscious understanding of stories and the way that we work. So humans are socialized into stories, both fictional and non-fictional, right? We acquire our narrativity, our ability to judge and to evaluate narratives, primarily through socialization. And remember I said we fill in the gaps in stories based on our own mental framework, okay? That mental framework, it's built on the stories that we are told. And yes, by our friends and our family, of course, but primarily through the stories that are sold to us, that are fed to us, right, by the mainstream media. We are storytelling animals. We love coherence. We love fidelity. That is why the media is able to tell us the same stories over and over again. In fact, we kind of like it when they do. So we hear the same stories over and over again so many times that makes it very easy for us to end up classifying them. As a narrative theorist, right, we have lots of different classification systems. One way to think about it is master plots. And I'm mixing a couple of different systems here. There's the 7 plots, the 20 master plots, the 31 functions, lots of ways. But when we think about it, we have the quest, the rivalry, the metamorphosis, the underdog, revenge, the chase, coming of age, so on and so forth. You know these stories. You've seen them all before, over and over again, not just in fictional stories, but in non-fictional stories as well. And these master plots, per se, are used to create stories that just perpetuate the same master narrative, the same dominant ideologies over and over again. You are always unconsciously identifying these kinds of plots and then filling in the gaps as you know them, right? You kind of have a mental CSI fingerprint database up there. You don't know it and you don't access it consciously, right? But when you're exposed to a story, you kind of flip through the files and you think, oh, I know this one, I know how it ends. Or I know this guy, I know what he's gonna do. Think about the good and evil story. Oh, I know this one, good and evil, that's a hero, he's gonna vanquish the evil, and then order will be restored in the universe. Or, wait, I'm cheering for this guy who's struggling, he triumphs in the end, that was the underdog story. It's gonna have a happy ending. What's wrong with this? So we identify with these stories, big deal. Well, the problem is you do it unconsciously, first of all. Second of all, let's just take those 2 examples, right? The good versus evil. It really matters who gets cast or what gets cast as good and evil in that story, okay? In order to do that, in order to reduce everything down to good and evil, you have to simplify things. You have to simplify this big, beautiful, complex thing known as life into master plots and usually into stereotypes, right? That underdog story, what's wrong with that? Well, think about that simplification. It takes out a lot of details, the kind of details that remind you that gender and race and geography have a lot to do with the access and privilege that allows somebody, right, to triumph, to go from rags to riches. So the ads and the news stories and the speeches that all use these, the master plots, the stereotypes, they're just reducing individuals, okay, usually to race and gender. Master plots, stereotypes, they're used to create stories that teach us what is normal. And over time, over a lot of exposure to different stories, you start to understand that if your lived experience does not match up to these stories that are being told and sold to you, that you are what is not normal. There's nothing wrong with the stories, there's something wrong with you. And then in that case, it's very easy for politicians and for corporations to sell you something to fix you or to fix the problem that comes along with the fact that you don't match the master narrative. So remember, the narrative paradigm operates not on logic, but on instinct, okay? So back to Fisher for a moment. The operative principle of narrative rationality is identification rather than deliberation. Okay? Remember how I said facts make more sense when they're presented as a story? Well, when facts are presented in a story that is familiar to us, we're very likely to accept it on gut instinct without ever examining it critically. So I said I was here to talk about stories, but what I'm really here to do is to ask you to do something. And that is to be deliberate, okay? I'm asking you to examine those narratives that you're presented with every day. Ask yourself, who's framing this story? Ask yourself, what are they selling you? And I don't just mean products, I mean values and beliefs. I want you to ask yourself that, am I just reflexively accepting that narrative that tells me I have to be prettier, thinner, richer? Am I just unconsciously accepting the story that tells me that that immigrant, that refugee, that person of color, that fill in the blank is a threat to my safety and security? Remember, stories are not just what we read in books and we see in movies and we tell each other over a glass of wine on Friday night. Stories really do shape our worldview, and we cannot let them do so uncritically. Remember what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, right? A single story is dangerous. We need people to tell more stories that do not correspond to the master narratives. We need more people to push back against stories that only tell a partial truth. Whoever controls the narrative has power. So take control of your story.